So how do we get from the idea of the moral lawgiver and a God who is present in the universe to what exactly that moral law is? So there's sort of the God of the philosophers. This has obviously puzzled a lot of religious philosophers.
Right.
There's the God of the philosophers, the sort of unmoved mover, the being that generates a unity to the universe and an order to the universe. How does that translate over into the sort of moral law that we practice or that we should practice? Can you just do all of this on the basis of reason alone, just looking at the universe through natural law, or do you need something like revelation?
I think that's a great question. In your book, I think you've brilliantly given that dialectic of reason and purpose and meaning. They are inextricably bound, and you really cannot have one without the other. The way we get to it is something like this. I do two frameworks on this, Ben, as an apologist dealing with the Judeo-Christian worldview. We all need to know the truth. Ultimately, we are in search for the truth, where we need to accept the fact. But how do we get to the truth? And philosophers of old have told us there's the correspondence theory of truth and the coherence theory of truth. Correspondence applies to particular statements. Coherence applies to a cumulative presentation of those statements. So when you go to a court of law, the correspondence and coherence theory are always brought to bear in determining guilt or innocence. But how do we get to it? I say there are three ways of logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. Is my argument logically consistent? Is there any empirical basis for me to believe what I'm believing? And is there any experiential relevance to all of this? But then this has to be applied to the four questions of life: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where do I come from? What does my life really mean? How do I distinguish between good and evil? What happens to a human being when he or she dies? That closing chapter in your conversation with your daughter is brilliant. The question of eternality even comes into the mind of a little one. There's that intuitive drive towards that. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Pursuit, truth. Correspondence, coherence. Logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance. When you form a worldview, these are the four questions you have to answer by applying the notions of truth. So with the moment you say the word revelation, this is one of those dinosaurs who actually believes a book dropped out of heaven, and so on and so forth. It's not as simplistic as that. You take the revelation of God that has come across a millennium and a half of revelation. You apply these tests and you see that the existence of God presents a framework for the existentially undeniable questions that we struggle with. Those very questions are legitimized because of the value that we claim. So yes, there's reason and revelation, but not some kind of pie in the sky by and by, but propositional truth that is put to the test by a scrutinizing mind. And the Judeo-Christian worldview, Ben, I believe, I was raised in a counterculture to this. I wasn't raised in either of those worldviews. I was a naturalist. I was a skeptic. And I ended up on a bed of suicide when I was 17 years old, desperately looking for the very thing your book talks about, that individual value and that individual purpose and a belongingness to a community and so on. And it was then when the Bible, I couldn't even hold the Bible, by the way, because my body was dehydrated. I had taken some poison that emptied me of all the water, moisture in my body. And then to see how God, through the flow of history, and of course, even though we have our differences, we have a common background in communion with God. Both of us have that goal. And in the person of Jesus Christ, I found that answer. And so my relationship to the person of God, as Job pointed out, as Habakkuk pointed out, that relationship is key because some answers to life transcend the propositional nature of things. They don't violate it, but they transcend it. So I think you get to the answer of who God is, not just by some leap of faith, which we sometimes attribute to people. Mine was a very reasoned study of scriptures, and the reasoning that we applied was a rational type, but the importance was there was a moral reasoning behind the whole process. So you don't just get to it by either reason or revelation. It's the confluence of both in proper balance.